Alrighty, welcome to Applications of Inequalities Part 2. And I've already written out the question here, and here's what it says. We have up to 200 acres upon which we are going to grow apples. Okay? Two types of apples that we're interested in planting, ambrosias and Fujis. The ambrosia apples cost $300 per acre in order to plant. And by the way, I'm just totally making this up. I have no idea if this is anywhere realistic or not, but that's beside the point. The Fujis, we're going to say they're a little cheaper. They only cost $200 per acre. And we've allocated a maximum of $54,000 for planting all of the apples. So the question that we really have that we want to do is to set up some inequalities to describe this whole situation. And then if we really wanted to get fancy, which I don't, but if we really want to get fancy, we could graph the inequalities we create and see if there is a true zone for all of the inequalities, in which case then we'd know this is a feasible project. If we didn't get a true zone for all of our inequalities, then we would say, well, this can't be done, not for this amount of money. So how do we do it? How do we set up inequalities for a rather complicated question like this? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is I got to put some variables in. And I'm going to say, well, why don't we say X acres is the amount of acres that we devote to ambrosia apples, and we'll put Y acres and devote those to the Fujis. Okay? So now a few little inequalities that are kind of no-brainers is that X would have to be greater than or equal to 0, as would Y, because you really can't plant a negative amount of apples. Okay, so that's, kind of goes without saying. And then a really good idea is to look at the extreme situations. What if we didn't plant any of the Fujis? What if it was all ambrosias, let's say? How many acres could we get away with if it was all ambrosias? Well, what you would do there is you would say then Y is 0, so I have X acres. Then to plant them, it's going to be $300 for each of those acres. So basically what I have is 300 times X. That's how much it's costing me. And I got to make sure that that is less than or equal to $54,000 because that's my maximum allowable budget. So if I divide the 300 into the other side, that tells me that if I went all ambrosias, I actually can't plant all 200 acres because I would run out of money. So if I divided the 300 in there, I would have a maximum of 180 acres for the ambrosia apples. And that's simply because my budget isn't that big. If I went with all Fujis, on the other hand, well, that would mean I have X to be 0. And that means that I would just have $200 times however many acres of Fujis, and that's got to be less than or equal to 54,000. And so if I divide the 200 into the other side, I see here that my upper end of the acres would be 270. Well, I only have 200 acres to plant, so I could never go over 200 anyway. So what this tells us is we have a little bit more restrictions. I'm just going to clear the page here. So what do we have for our restrictions? Okay, so on the one hand, X has to be greater than or equal to 0. Y has to be greater than or equal to 0. We also have X has to be less than or equal to 180. And Y has to be less than or equal to 200. And it's 200 because that's how many acres we have. Okay, so that's some of my inequalities. Then I have a little bit more. This one's pretty straightforward here. What about X plus Y? So here's the acres of ambrosias plus the acres of Fujis. Well, that's going to have to be less than or equal to 200 because that's how many acres we have. So that one's pretty straightforward. And then what about the cost? Well, $300 for every acre of ambrosia, plus $200 for every acre of Fuji's, and this also is restricted. We have to have this less than or equal to $54,000. Otherwise, we could go bankrupt. And these are the inequalities. And since we're not testing to see if it actually is possible or not, that is the end of this question. So we've laid out what the inequalities are. If we wanted to keep going, we would basically graph these and see if there's an overlap of all of the inequalities. But I don't feel like doing that, so I'm going to stop.